Hey guys, my name is Mannequin. Welcome back to EDM Pro Tips. Today's video is on microphones. Oh, I tried to record this video a second ago, but something went wrong and the video didn't record. So here's shot number 2, but this time it should be a little more concise since I have everything thought out. So today's video we're talking about microphones, and there's a whole bunch of different things you can learn about microphones, but the one thing I want to just say right off the bat is that tone is what counts. You'll find that the way microphones are, each has its own tone, and each vocalist or each instrument you're using has its own tone as well. So essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to match up a tone of a microphone with whatever you're recording. That said, it's easier said than done. Now, first of all, you might not have the ear to be able to tell at first, and second of all, even more so, you can't just search online what the formula is for figuring it out, and you can't just look at specs to figure it out. You have to try the microphones, and you have to use those microphones to record those specific things. So essentially it all boils down to tone. Keep that in mind throughout the entirety of this video, and you should be set. So we have 3 main types of microphones. The first one is dynamic microphones. Those ones are used for the live performances. Like whenever you see someone running around with a microphone, holding it like that, it's a dynamic microphone. It's one of the most, it's actually probably the most popular one type to use for live performances. And it has decent sound overall. It's better than using a regular, crappy computer microphone for something. So dynamic microphones they're pretty good quality, but I wouldn't call it amazing quality. Condenser microphones are where things start to get amazing sounding. When you record with a condenser microphone, everything just automatically sounds amazing. Now that it also brings some problems with it as well. We'll talk about those later. But just keep in mind the condenser microphones tend to sound a lot more open and transparent, but you can't use them for a live situation for reasons that you'll pick up feedback, and there will be other issues that you might run into as well. So there's those ones. And then finally, the third type of microphone is a ribbon microphone. Ribbon microphones are extremely sensitive to basically dying. If you drop it, or if you let it get too hot or too cold, it'll ruin it. So you need to be extremely careful with those ones. And also their sound is known to be a little bit smoother and more open than condenser microphones, but not always in a good way. Sometimes it's a way that you wouldn't necessarily want. So we have these 3 types of microphones. What's their purposes? What's the differences and everything like that? Well, the first one we have is the dynamic microphone. Dynamic microphones, like I said, they're used for live settings. They tend to have a roll-off in the high end, and they tend to sound harsh in the high end. They don't really, honestly, they don't sound great for recording. So I'd only suggest getting one of those if you want to use it for using, for live performances, or additionally, if you have a vocalist or an instrument that just sounds great through a dynamic microphone for some reason or another. Some vocalists, I have heard they sound terrible on condenser microphones, but when you stick them on a dynamic microphone, the dynamic microphone just picks it up better. So that personally, I haven't experienced that, but I have heard some people say that. So dynamic microphones are not completely out of the question, but they're okay. So now the one thing you want to keep in mind is these ones do not require phantom power, but if you have phantom power, it will not kill them most of the time. So what phantom power is basically, it's also called 48 volt power supply. And what that allows you to do is power microphones that require more power. Dynamic microphones, usually they don't care whether or not you have that. Some of them will be fried if you have phantom power on, you plug them in. So you just need to be a little bit careful about that. Make sure that there's no warning on the microphone that says don't use with phantom power. Most of them are okay with phantom power. So I only really have one suggestion by way of dynamic microphones. That's the Shure SM58. It is known for being extremely robust, and there are literally stories of people that have said they used it to nail in something before a concert and then they used it and it worked fine. I don't know if that's 100% true, but that's basically a reputation they have. If you drop it, it's fine. And the tone itself is also pretty good. That's kind of why it's known so much in the live performance industry. Most of the microphones you'll find for live performances are the Shure SM58s, and those ones are just extremely popular for live performances. There are some specs about them that aren't worth listing off, but those ones you could use pretty much any type of cable to plug it into whatever, and it'll work. You don't need to have this fancy audio interface. You could just take a dynamic microphone, plug it into some sort of cable with an adapter, and then just plug it straight into your microphone jack on whatever the heck you have, and it should work, just because the way dynamic microphones are kind of wired up. So that's dynamic microphones. Condenser microphones. These are the ones that recording engineers use most of the time. Now, obviously, sometimes they use dynamic microphones, sometimes they use ribbons. But for the most part, they use condenser microphones. So, sorry about that. Okay, so now, condenser microphones are a lot more open. They have a lot of detail, but with that comes a few issues that you need to keep in mind. First of all, is that when you have high sensitivity, you need a quiet environment to record in. If you have a fan going, then usually you'll have to turn that off to record. But even more so, to just put into perspective how sensitive these microphones are, if you run one of these microphones up at a high volume level, and you're just kind of listening on your headphones, if you have someone go on the other side of your room and scratch the wall, you will be able to hear it through the microphone, and it will be picked up by the recording. So you need to be very careful about that. Dynamic microphones will not do that. If you're a dynamic microphone, run it up really loud and scratch something on the other end of the room, you probably won't hear it, because they're a lot less sensitive to sound like that. So condenser microphones are extremely sensitive, so you need to be making sure that you don't have a lot of noise going on in your recording space. That said, there's also another thing you need to keep in mind. I'm in a closet here, which kind of seems irrelevant. But if you listen, you could hear there's reverb on my voice. And my brother has commented, "Why are you recording in the closet? It sounds so terrible." He might see this video and he might ask me why I put this in the video. But essentially, aside from why I'm recording in here, just realize the reverb you hear and the fact that it doesn't sound all that great. Like if you can compare my recordings in here with my mastering EDM series, you'll notice there's a drastic difference in audio quality. Partially because I'm using a condenser microphone, and partially because I'm not recording inside a closet. So when you're using a condenser microphone, you want to get rid of this extra reverb. And the way you do that is by acoustically treating your space. I'll talk about acoustic treatment in a later video because that is part of upgrading your studio. And it's just, there's a lot of controversy on how you should do it. But I'm going to talk about the basics of it later. For now, just realize when you record in an area, you probably want some sort of acoustic treatment just to kind of give you a slightly better sound. So, that said, there's also one final thing. With condenser microphones, you usually have to have phantom power. And that's because with that high sensitivity, you need enough voltage to drive the microphone. So, so make sure your audio interface has phantom power. And you can also get a preamp with phantom power, but that's going to run you a lot more money than just getting an audio interface, because preamps are a lot more like tonally. You buy a preamp for the tone, not necessarily to add phantom power to something. So that's usually the case, not always the case. So so condenser microphones are a lot more sensitive to use for recording vocals, guitars, instruments, amps, basically anything. Anything that creates audio. Condenser microphones are used in studios for recording pretty much everything. And by way of suggestions, I have three suggestions. Two are affordable, one's insane by way of price. And generally speaking, you could go for one of those, but what I really suggest is trying out a whole bunch of microphones for what you want to record with. Because like if you have a dedicated vocalist, you'll want to find the microphone that works best for them. If you just generally have a whole bunch of vocalists that are coming in, or you're recording tons of different things, you'll either want different microphones so you can kind of mix and match depending on who or what you're recording, or you'll just want a catch-all microphone depending on how much you have to spend. So my two suggestions here are basically the Rode NT1 and the AudioTechnica AT-2035. Those ones are both very popular microphones for around $150, and the AT-2035 is going to be a lot more transparent sounding, so it sounds a lot clearer. The NT1A is going to sound, it's going to be a bit more high shelf sounding, but it can accentuate the good points of quite a few different vocalists out there. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's not completely transparent. Now, which one you choose is up to you. Do you want one that's transparent? Do you want one that is supposed to be tonally designed to be better for vocalists and guitars and stuff like that? So that's up to you. And then the third suggestion is insane because it costs around $1,000, if not considerably more. And it's the Neumann U87. And that microphone is well known in the recording industry. And it's basically, you know, if you have a professional studio where you consider yourself a big studio, then if you don't have a U87, you're either making a statement or you've never heard of them. So U87s are bought by a lot of big studios, and they're just really well known for the audio quality. So some other information about just condenser microphones in general, and we'll talk about pickup patterns later, but for now I want to kind of talk about just specific to condenser microphones. There are things called noise floor and signal to noise ratio, which are only important on cheap microphones. So if you're buying like a microphone for under $100, then you might want to care what the signal to noise ratio is, what the noise floor is. Lower noise floor is better, higher signal to noise ratio is better. They're basically just kind of inverses. So, and essentially what it means is this is basically how much self noise the microphone generates. So if you got it and had it recording in a place where there was literally no sound, how much noise would be in the recording? And it doesn't matter all that much because most microphones nowadays are pretty good about dealing with that, and you're more likely to pick up noise from just like white noise from around the room than you are to actually pick up the noise from the microphone itself. So, so you don't need to worry about that too much, especially if you spend over $100 on a microphone. And frequency response curves are garbage. Do not look at them. They're pretty much useless because they're averaged. Essentially, the actual response curve looks very bumpy and it bounces around a lot, but the companies tend to smooth them, which doesn't really tell you much about the sound. So the only way to really learn about the sound of a microphone is to actually get it and record something and listen to it. So so that's those couple of specs you want to just kind of keep in mind. And there are some other things I'll talk about later by way of features of microphones, but that's going to be after I cover ribbon microphones. Ribbon microphones are, like I said, they're considered more sensitive than condenser microphones, but they don't require phantom power. In fact, a lot of them will blow out if you try to plug a phantom power. Ribbon microphones are extremely sensitive to dropping. If you drop it, chances are it won't survive. A condenser microphone might survive if you drop it. It depends on where and how you drop it. But ribbon microphones are not very likely to survive a drop. And they're also very sensitive to temperature as well as, and humidity can also ruin them. So you need to be very careful with them. What are they usually used for? Usually used for acoustic guitar and piano. So that's why I really don't have any suggestions or recommendations for ribbon microphones, because you don't use them on vocals as much. Now, there might be a rare chance that you'd use it on vocals, but that'd be if you're doing like you really know what you're doing and you really know why you chose that one. So not too many suggestions by way of ribbon microphones, except for the fact that they're extremely fragile. They're known to be very sensitive, and you could blow them out with phantom power. That's one of the things you have to be very careful about. So that pretty much covers the basis for all the different types of microphones. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of features you could find in microphones. The first one you'll find is a spec and kind of a feature at the same time. My nose is really itchy. So essentially what you have is you have different pickup patterns. So if you have the microphone, actually, timeout. Okay, handy, have a microphone right here. So this will kind of make things make a lot more sense here. So we have pickup patterns. The first one I'll talk about is cardioid. The second one is hypercardioid, and we'll talk about the difference in a minute here. But essentially, what cardioid is it basically gets a bubble out around this microphone here. It's kind of like a heart shape. That's why it's called cardioid. So if you look at it from the top, it's going to be kind of like this, and this being the front of the microphone. So it's basically going to pick up everything in front of it and not too much stuff behind it. Most microphones, if you want to make a general assumption about microphones and just like overgeneralize everything, you could say that microphones are going to tend to be cardioid microphones. So they have that kind of heart shape, generally picking up this little bubble in front of it. So that's what you're going to tend to find in most microphones, but there are a couple other ones. So the next one is hypercardioid, which you'll mostly find in dynamic microphones. And I don't mean most dynamic microphones have it. I'm saying when you find a hypercardioid microphone, it's mostly on dynamic microphones. And the way a hypercardioid works is it's like a cardioid, except for instead of being like this bubble shape, it's more like an oval, and it picks up more towards the front. So this one, the little, it's not one that you actually go in from the top. It's a side address, which means you go in from the side. So that means that it's going to be kind of like an oval, kind of like this. But it won't be, now just keep in mind that this is generally speaking, just kind of give you an idea of what it's like. A hypercardioid is not too different from a cardioid. It's just slightly more focused. And the reason you might want to use that is in a live situation. If you have a lot of loud noise, then you might end up with a what do you call it? You might end up with a feedback that can be avoided if you have a hypercardioid microphone, because sometimes when you're using a regular dynamic microphone, some of the sound leaks in from the side. If you have hypercardioid, it picks up less from the sides of the microphone, so you don't have to worry about that much. As much rather. So that's hypercardioid, mostly just on dynamic microphones, not to worry about. The next one is bidirectional. Bidirectional gets a bubble shape that goes out in a circle on this side and a circle on this side. So there's kind of like a gap here and here that it doesn't really pick up. But essentially, I don't know what you would use that for. My only thought would be for like if you're doing a choir and you want to kind of pick up directions of that. So that might be when you would want to use a bidirectional microphone. But most cases, there's not too much use for it in terms of EDM and production. Now, you might find cases where you'd use them, but personally, I've never ran into cases where I'd ever even think about buying one that specifically has that. If I bought a microphone and it had that as well, we'll talk about that in a second, but then I wouldn't mind. But most cases, you're actually just going to have you're just basically going to need cardioid. So that's kind of what you'll find in most cases. Now, the other one is omnidirectional, which you could find in condensers and ribbon microphones. And bidirectional, by the way, is also condensers and ribbons. So omnidirectional is basically, instead of getting a bubble here and a bubble here, what you're doing is you're getting an entire sphere around the microphone that basically picks up the sound more or less equally. So once again, it's one of the ones you're not going to use as much, but it's kind of good to know what it is. Why did I say if I bought a microphone that had it, I wouldn't be too upset? Well, the reason is some microphones can actually switch between cardioid, bidirectional, and omnidirectional. So some of them will have a little switch on it. It'll give you the option, and then you can actually choose that. So feel free to run for one of those if you want to, but you'll probably only use cardioid just because it helps minimize noise and it helps minimize what reflections you might have in your recording environment from reverb from bouncing off the walls and stuff. So that's, it's not really something you'd probably use too much, but it's there. There's also two other features that you'll find in microphones which you may or may not want. One is called a pad, found on condensers and sometimes ribbons, I think. What a pad does is if you're recording with a condenser in a really loud environment, it'll usually cause the condenser to get overloaded. So what you do is you flip the pad on, and what it does is it decreases the output level so that you could actually you could hear the sound and it's not clipping as much. So it kind of just acts as basically like a little gain switch that cuts the gain by a lot. So that's kind of, it's a nifty feature to have if you ever want to record something really loud, but usually not something that you'd actually want to have to go for. And the final thing is a low cut. Some microphones will have a low cut, and it's up to you whether or not you want to use it, but personally I see no reason to get one with one. And if I had one with it, I would record with the low cut off, and then I just add the low cut when I went into the actual mixing stage. So that's basically all you need to know. One thing I guess I should touch on is XLR. Hopefully you can see this. That's what XLR looks like. I kind of talked about it in one of my other videos. But the one thing you want to be careful about XLR and condenser microphones is you need to have phantom power running these microphones. If you get what's called a unbalanced XLR cable, then you can fry your condenser microphone by running phantom power into it. You need to make sure it's balanced. Most XLRs are balanced, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you find one that says unbalanced XLR, that is a bad sign. Do not get it. Essentially what it does is it shorts two of the pins together and can fry your microphone. So be careful about that. Always buy balanced XLR cables. And one thing to keep in mind is most of the time if it doesn't say, it's balanced. But if you want to be really safe and sure, find a cable that actually says it is balanced. So but that's one of the things you don't need to worry about too much. It's just kind of just a note there. That's one of the things that I've kind of picked up from my searches online. If you get a unbalanced cable, then you can fry your microphone. So be careful about that. And don't plug a a ribbon microphone into a phantom power supply either. That doesn't go well. But dynamic microphones can usually handle phantom power, and condenser microphones usually need phantom power. So that's that. I think that's pretty much all I needed to cover by way of microphones. I don't think there's anything else by way of stuff you could really look into. I guess one of the things worth mentioning is shock mounts. Shock mounts are kind of useful for microphones. They keep it so that if you accidentally move a microphone, you won't hear the noise as much. But shock mounts, you don't need to worry about having a shock mount. And then you might want to get a pop filter for your microphone as well, which is basically this little circular mesh that you stick in front of it. And you will need that if you're going to be recording a vocalist. Now, that said, it doesn't matter which one you get. Do not buy an expensive one because there's no difference between cheap and expensive ones. So that's pretty much it. I don't think there's anything other than that you'd really need to look into. But it's just generally, like I said at the start of this video, focus on the tone. If you can, try as many different microphones as you can before you settle on one, because you know your tone and you know what you want. And when you get a microphone that is more suited for your sound, then it's just generally, it kind of enhances the tone a little bit better than if you just go in and you try to EQ it to make it sound better. So if you can, try it out. If you can't, just get one of the suggestions that I said. Normally, if you're just going to be doing a recording for guitars and vocals for EDM, then you just need a condenser microphone with a large diaphragm. I didn't talk about that. That's what I forgot. Oh, it's a good thing I kept on going. Okay, diaphragm sizes, and also the difference between pencil and side address microphones. So there are two different types of diaphragm sizes. This is by way of condenser microphones. And the large diaphragm is used for a acoustic guitar, piano, and vocals. Small diaphragm is used for acoustic guitar and drums and some other things, but usually not vocals. So just without talking about too much the difference between the two in a physics sense, they have different tones, and that's kind of what they're generally used for. So if you're getting a microphone for vocals, get a large diaphragm microphone. Now make sure you don't make the same mistake I did. This is not a large diaphragm microphone. It's an MXL 990. It has a large capsule, which is basically a marketing way of saying, oh yeah, but the capsule's the size of a large diaphragm. The capsule's the size, but the actual diaphragm itself is smaller than the stinking capsule. So this is actually a small diaphragm condenser in a large capsule. So useless there in terms of how they gave that information out. But remember, diaphragm size is different from capsule size. Keep that in mind. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was pencil versus side address condenser microphones. This is a side address condenser microphone. I talked about that before. It's because the sound goes in through the side. It does not go in through the top. Pencil microphones are a lot thinner and they're kind of longer. They look like basically a thick version of a pencil. And sound goes in the front of those. Now, side address are typically used for vocals and guitar and piano and stuff like that, whereas pencil are once again used more for the like acoustic guitar, drums, and things like that. So basically, side address tends to be large diaphragm and pencil tends to be small diaphragm. But as you can see in the case of this microphone, just because it's side address doesn't mean it's large diaphragm. So make sure if you're doing vocals, you get a large diaphragm condenser microphone. So that's one thing to keep in mind for sure. But other than that, the exact size doesn't really matter because it's the tone that really matters, not necessarily the measurement of the size. So anyway, that's pretty much all I had to cover here. And the next video is going to be on live performance gear. And I'll talk about just generally, live performance gear, what different things you could have by way of that, and some general ideas as to what you could look into by way of options. But hopefully this video is helpful and some good content in it. And I did just realize when I was doing this video that I do need to do a video on acoustic treatment. So I'm going to add that to the list as well. I don't have acoustic treatment personally, but I've read a lot about it. And it's a very confusing topic, but there are some just general pointers you could take away and just some general things you could do by way of basic acoustic treatment. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.